we're right now witnessing a pretty terrible war between Russia and Ukraine. And you might wonder, what does that have to do with the topic I'm supposed to be speaking about, which is Afghanistan? But of course, it has a lot to do with it. And it has a lot to do as well with security in the Gulf. Other than probably the administration itself, everyone thinks that the way the Afghan war ended was nothing short of a chaotic disaster. The reason I mentioned the war in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, is precisely because it's arguable that Mr. Putin saw what was going on in Afghanistan and concluded that this was probably as good a time as any to try to invade and take over Ukraine, given that the United States seemed totally disorganized. The withdrawal from Afghanistan came as a surprise for many of, if not most of our allies. Again, Putin sitting in the Kremlin assumed that the allies and we would be on different pages and in disarray. But he, of course, wasn't the only one to make that assumption. The Iranians, of course, the North Koreans, the Chinese, just about everybody assumed that the way we mismanaged the withdrawal indicated either that we had lost interest, which to a great extent it was arguable that we did, or that we simply did not know how to walk and chew gum, which arguably we could not either. So it could have been both of these. Let me talk a little bit about what went wrong at the end of Afghanistan and how it might have been perceived, since the concern is about the Gulf, by the Gulf allies, Israel, I would add as well, and Syria, Russia, and of course, Iran. Mr. Trump had announced that he wanted out of Afghanistan. He had pretty much said that as he was standing for the presidency in 2016. He was constantly convinced not to pull all the troops out, but he finally decided that he needed to negotiate with the Taliban. He chose Zalmay Khalilzad, who had been ambassador to Afghanistan, who's a native-born Afghan, who speaks Pashto, to be the lead negotiator. It's worth noting that regardless of what Mr. Trump would say about Muslims, and he had some very horrible things to say about Muslims, Khalilzad is, of course, a Muslim. And not only that, he was one of the first supporters of Mr. Trump when the man was still standing for the nomination. So he gets Khalilzad to negotiate, but he puts tremendous pressure on him to reach a deal. And if you actually look at the text of the deal, the Taliban offers very, very little. The United States, and it was the United States, negotiating literally without, behind the backs, you might say, certainly without the Ashraf Ghani government in Kabul being involved, much to the consternation of the Kabul people. The agreement essentially committed the Taliban to very, very little, but 5,000 prisoners were released. Taliban prisoners were released almost as a show of good faith, who promptly went back and joined the Taliban again. Trump had wanted everybody out by May of 21. Biden gets elected. I think Trump thought he would be reelected and he could then push for that date. But that's not what happened. The Taliban, which had in any event controlled much of the countryside before the negotiations even had begun, and arguably had the allegiance of people for two primary reasons that a brilliant analyst named Carter Mulcanian has just published in his book called The War in Afghanistan, which is probably going to be the book on the war. He pointed out that the great advantage that the Taliban had was first Islam, not Islamism, Islam. They were representing the religion that most Afghans belonged to and identified with. And they were opposing forces that were essentially being managed by non-Muslims. So that was one reason. The other reason is simply that the Taliban were nationalists. They were Afghan nationalists. The government forces, much less so. They weren't sure what they were fighting for. So the Taliban is sweeping up the countryside anyway. Come May, by that point, May 21, Joe Biden is the president. He postpones the departure. He's committed to the departure, but he doesn't do very much planning. He doesn't inform his allies. He kind of lets things just go. And then you have the chaotic exit. You have a decision to evacuate the Bagram Air Base first. I've been to that air base a number of times, actually. And Bagram is much bigger than the Kabul International Airport. The argument that the administration supporters made was, well, it would be hard for people to get to Bagram. It's, I think, 35 or so kilometers further out than Kabul, but further out from where? I mean, it depends where you're living, doesn't it? If you're living in the north, Bagram is easier. If you're living in the south, Kabul is easier. If you're living far away from Kabul, what's the difference? So there are more runways at Bagram. It would have not only enabled more people to leave more systematically, but we would still have provided air cover for them, and that would have kept the Taliban and the Haqqani group and even ISIS, perhaps, which is also operating in Afghanistan, at bay. Well, none of that happened, and everyone knows how chaotic it was. Now, what was the reaction? The Gulf states, as you probably know, have been hedging against the United States for some time. It's not getting better. It's actually getting worse. The Abraham Accord, in one respect, was a success for the United States, but in another respect, it indicated how the balance of power in the region is simply changing, and that the Arab states in particular are recognizing that they may not be able to call upon the United States as they thought they could in the past. Why? Because the National Defense Strategy of 2018 that was issued by the Defense Department and the National Security Strategy upon which it's based prioritized China and Russia. And frankly, not even Russia so much. It was China. And it was made clear that Middle East was no longer as high a priority as it had been. The Afghanistan withdrawal, of course, underlined that. But that was already in the cards before then. And the Abraham Accords essentially demonstrated that the Gulf Arabs felt that they had to shore up their defenses in a variety of ways. Yes, they would stay close to the United States. Some of them reached out to Russia. China has begun to penetrate the region, but also Israel because of its high technology and its military capability, and the shared distrust, if not enmity, toward Iran. Now, the Iranians looked at the Afghan withdrawal rather differently. You may not remember or may not know, but in the beginning of the Afghan war, the Iranians actually cooperated with us. And that came to an end pretty quickly, but the Iranian Shia had no great love for the Taliban. This time around, though, they were reaching out to the Taliban. 20 years of hostility toward the United States and led them to try to reach out. And in fact, they seem to have, up to now, at least decent relations with the Taliban. The Iranians, of course, want to get some kind of agreement. Not so much that they want the agreement, they want the sanctions lifted again that have been imposed on them. They want those lifted. And again, the Biden administration made it clear it wanted a deal. Not really very surprising, given that Mr. Biden himself, the Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, the chief negotiator, Bob Malley, were all veterans of the previous JCPOA. And so reviving it shouldn't have come as a shock to anyone. Of course, What the Iranians wanted was sanctions lifted. And frankly, for the Gulf states and for Israel, the issue is less about Iran going nuclear, although Israel talks a lot about that. Uh, but Israel's got a deterrent. What it doesn't have is the ability to stop the Iranians from penetrating Syria, penetrating the Golan, arming Hezbollah. What the Gulf Arabs don't have is the ability to stop the Iranians from penetrating Bahrain, from causing trouble in Saudi Arabia, from supporting the Houthis. By the way, the Emirates are furious at the United States, first for taking the Houthis off the terrorism list, given that they are so closely aligned with the Iranians, and not really saying very much when the Houthis started firing missiles at the Emirates, as it has at the Saudis as well. So any kind of deal that will relieve the Iranians of some of the sanctions pressure, even if not all of it, and some of it will remain simply because the Congress isn't going to lift sanctions, and those the president cannot lift on his own. But there will be enough there to free up resources, and those resources are going to go to support the troublemaking that Iran has been doing for decades. There are rumors about what this deal could also involve, taking certain individuals off the terrorism list, including some people who were involved in the bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires in the 80s. Clearly, there's almost a desperation to get the deal, which is being reinforced. And this, by the way, just shows you how really everything is connected with everything else nowadays. It's being reinforced by the fact that the administration's sanctions against Russia, Russian oil, I should say, and the likelihood that the British and the Europeans are going to do so, even if it's more gradual, is going to add to the tremendous increase in gasoline prices at the petrol stations, as you people would say, that already are at record highs. And for Americans that are so dependent on cars, as are most people nowadays, that's a shock. That's a huge chunk of their weekly or biweekly pay packets. And that's a big driver of inflation. And so one way to offset that increase is to let Iranian oil flow to the West. That is a huge conundrum for the administration. But again, if there's a deal and sanctions are lifted, that's what they want. They want the oil. And so you can look at what's happened in Afghanistan and how it's redounded to in different ways to different countries in the region and beyond. Of course, one big surprise for Putin, at least, and to some extent, I think, although it hasn't been talked that much about in the Gulf or frankly, even in Israel, is the fact that Biden was able to pull the alliance together. Putin gambled that NATO was fractured, partly because of the way we pulled out of Afghanistan, leaving the allies, frankly, high and dry, and who had to fend for themselves without much coordination. Also, again, to show you how things connect with one another, there was a tremendous resentment on the part of the French for the deal that the United States and Britain made with Australia to essentially replace French Barracuda nuclear submarines with American or British-built nuclear submarines and American nuclear technology. That angered the French. So Putin's sitting and looking at all this. He's looking at Afghanistan. He's looking at these deals, and he figures NATO is not going to be very cohesive, and he was wrong. And of course, the fact that Biden did take that lead does, I think, to some extent, reassure our Arab friends and Israel that we will stand by them. And as everyone knows, Biden has not only dispatched more troops to Europe, but he's basically said he's not going to allow 1 inch of NATO territory being taken. Israel's a major non-NATO ally of the United States. So is Bahrain, by the way. And Saudi Arabia still has a close relationship, although it's a very complex one because of what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist that everyone believes uh, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, was behind his killing. Um, that one's not going to go away for a very simple reason. Khashoggi was a journalist who was part of the American journalistic circle. And the columnists in particular are just not going to let that go away. They're going to keep pounding the table. And Saudi Arabia has its issues with Congress, as to some extent does the UAE. Uh, all of which, of course, again, point to hedging, point to they were reaching out to the Russians. It's much more difficult now. It does point to Chinese penetration. And China, by the way, uh, had hosted the Taliban leadership, including Baradar, the number 2 in the Taliban, literally a couple of weeks before the evacuation of Kabul. The Chinese are penetrating all over. They have a long-term arrangement with the Iranians for about $25 billion, as I recall. It's going to involve building ports or at least improving ports in the Gulf. It's going to involve joint training and more serious types of exercises than they've had up to now. And so again, you look at China's view of how America got out of Afghanistan and China's overall thrust, not just in the Middle East, obviously, but everywhere, to essentially replace the United States as the world's leading power, and particularly as the world's guarantor of the economic system. It's not so much that China wants a different system, it just wants to run the system that currently exists and run it in its own interests, of course. So you can see that what Afghanistan has led to is a further fractionation of the international balance. And look at, say, one more country, and I see already there's somebody on the chat. Oh, no, it just says I may begin. That's the only thing I was seeing on the chat. Okay, I'll keep going then. India is in a very unusual situation as well. 141 countries condemned the Ukrainian and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. India was not one of them. Of course, China wasn't one of them either. But 60-odd% of Indian equipment is still Russian. And although India is closer to the United States, Australia, and Japan in the Quad because of its concern about China, it doesn't want to give up the Russian relationship. It also has a tremendous relationship with Israel, and less so with the Gulf. And that's a historic issue, but they continue to try to reach out westwards toward the Gulf. So again, this growing multipolarity has an impact, which the Afghan withdrawal underscored, has an impact on how the regional countries in the Middle East see themselves. Now, you have a very different situation in Iraq and in Syria. There was a meeting in Baghdad, sort of a reconciliation meeting almost, with the Gulf countries, but little has come of that. And meanwhile, Iran continues to support militias in Iraq. The Iraqis are among the countries that have insisted they will have absolutely no part of the Abraham Accord. The Saudis have hedged on that. The Iraqis have been very, very negative about it. Even though Israel and the Kurds in the north have had a good relationship for decades. But the Iraqis don't have their own government sorted out yet. They've had elections and they still don't have a new government. They don't have a new president. They don't really have a prime minister yet. It's all interim. And so the Iranians are able to exploit that. And they are much more active in Iraq than the United States is. The United States is there, but its presence is nothing like what it was even a few years ago. And then, of course, there's Syria. And the interesting thing about the Russian position in Syria is that regardless of what happens in Ukraine, the Russians are in Syria for the long term. They have, for the first time ever, a long-term lease. I guess there's now 97 or 96 years left on it for an airbase at Zakheim. They have a lease, a long-term lease as well for the naval facility at Tartus. They've been there before, so they're not going anywhere. On the other hand, there is friction between them and the Iranians, and if there's an agreement on the nuclear deal, the Iranians are just going to have a lot more money to spend. Uh, One might have thought they'd spend it on their own people, but there's no reason to believe that. And so, if you start at Afghanistan and finish at Syria or at Iraq, you begin to see why the Gulf states are deeply, deeply concerned about their own security. And quite frankly, I don't think they believe that Iran will adhere to a treaty, or it wouldn't be a treaty, excuse me, it'd be an agreement not to continue with its nuclear program if it wants to. It'll has violated the previous agreement. It's had secret facilities that mostly the Israelis were able to discover. There's no reason to believe that if they really want a nuclear weapon, they'll go for it anyway. And they have an incentive to. And the reason that the incentive is simply Ukraine. Had Ukraine retained its nuclear weapons, Russia would have had a lot more trouble invading them. North Korea has yet to be attacked by the United States because it's a nuclear power. There was talk in the 90s about doing something to North Korea, about taking out some of their facilities. Never happened. And so Iran looks at all of that. It may well conclude either that it doesn't want to cut a deal unless somehow all sanctions are lifted. And by the way, they also would like a guarantee that if there's a new deal, it will not be abrogated. Well, quite frankly, since the new deal would not be a congressionally approved treaty, and even those can be abrogated. The ABM treaty was abrogated. We walked away from that within the rules of the treaty, by the way, but we did walk away. An executive agreement, just as President Trump ditched Obama's agreement, the next president or the president after could ditch a Biden agreement. So Iran doesn't even have the guarantee that the agreement would be there and that the sanctions would not be restored. Plus, it sees that having a nuclear weapon deters people, deters whoever you think your enemies are. Of course, if they actually do that, then the Saudis and the Emiratis, of course, will build their own weapons. And then you're going to have a Middle East loaded with nuclear states. And then all it takes is one mistake, because at that point, you will have had from North Korea all the way over, frankly, to NATO, a chain of nuclear weapon states. And all it takes is one mistake. And that would be a disaster. So when you look at Afghanistan, you look at what happened, you begin to see that it has changed national calculations in Moscow, in the West, in Washington, and in the region, beyond what they had already changed as they watched Mr. Trump keep saying that he really wanted to get out of Europe, get out of the Middle East. And by the way, he wasn't even the first, because President Obama had said nation building should begin at home, and he already started this inward focus. And there's no doubt that the vast majority of Americans would quite happily ignore the world if they possibly could. What that means for America's friends that are not treaty allies, and even if they are treaty allies, is highly questionable. It'll depend on the leadership of a president. President Roosevelt supported the British, even when the majority of Americans were openly isolationist, and many supported the Nazis. It'll take leadership, and it's not going to take one leader, for 4 years. It's going to take consistent leadership, as we basically had during the Cold War. That, if you're sitting in Riyadh, if you're sitting in Tehran, if you're sitting in Tel Aviv, if in Jerusalem rather, if you're sitting in Abu Dhabi, and anywhere in the region, you don't know where the Americans are going to be, and you're going to continue to hedge. So why don't I stop there? I've spoken for about a half hour or so, and take some questions if you have any.
Sorry, Tom, I want to know, maybe would Oliver want to make a rebuttal, or sort of would he, not a rebuttal, but a joiner to what you said, and then afterwards maybe bring in all the questions together?
Sure.
Sure. No, I mean, look, I was fascinated by that. Dov, thank you so much. And much of it, it's difficult to disagree with. I think a couple of just nuances, perhaps, to draw on. And one, the first, I suppose, is an observation that complements what you've said, which is, I think, nobody can predict, not least those traditional allies within the region, what US policy will look like going forward. That's been really clear. And in my meetings in Riyadh, in my meetings in Abu Dhabi and elsewhere, that uncertainty, and that is equally true, by the way, with the British government, perhaps more so, funny enough, in certain countries in the Gulf, that uncertainty has really unsettled power brokers. And therefore, policymakers are really struggling to find what they do. Their previous certainties have gone, to put it very simplistically. So I couldn't agree with that more. I think another angle, just quickly, which draws on the Afghanistan point, is the weeping, festering sore of Yemen, which sits there carrying on with very little column coverage in newspapers at the moment. If you think COVID's fallen from the agenda, try being a Yemeni. That is something that the Gulf at the moment are going to have to deal with, and the level of opprobrium on Twitter and things is high, but it's not garnering much in terms of the world. I think that's something that we ignore at our peril, because that is also a safe haven for extremism, something that nobody particularly wants to talk about in the Gulf, but is really, really important. One of the things that Mohammed bin Salman has done in the most populous state in the Arab Gulf is to make a huge gamble, really, in opening up. There is much talk of Neom, being this huge city, having alcohol. Much of this, and without being too dramatic, and again, I'm oversimplifying deliberately here, much of those development plans rely on keeping that conservative ulama within Saudi Arabia bluntly quiet and in a corner. That window of opportunity is ever diminishing with struggles. Now, I spoke earlier about the price of oil. Some people say that the high price of oil is very positive for the Gulf. And of course, on one level it is. On another level, it's always seen a backslide on diversification. It's always seen a backslide in terms of social development, would be my observation. You may choose to disagree with that. So I think that's really, really important. Add Iran into that mix and Israel and the Abraham Accords, you do end up with a situation of geopolitics that like we've not seen for a while. And my final point, because I think it really is time for some questions, would be, again, I put this out, it's the end of the day, so I'm prepared to be a bit punchy. It's whether the level of, a new level of realpolitik has come about, and whether we might see Iranian sanctions against Iran reduced, at least in a bid to get that oil flowing. As I said earlier, I don't actually believe that the oil will flow immediately. It won't make a huge impact immediately. I genuinely don't believe that. Russia, of course, have already, as we saw in the FT, I think yesterday, they covered that Russia have already tried to wheedle and blow that up anyway. So a really interesting point there. I just wonder whether, and it would be US led, I suppose, whether, Dov, perhaps you can answer that, whether you see realpolitik in the old-fashioned sense perhaps expediting some thawing of relations.
Well, all good points. Let me just focus on a couple because, as you said, I did touch on most of them. On Yemen, as I said, the Iranians are supporting the Houthis. The Houthis have been firing missiles at both the Saudis and the Emiratis, without much comment from the United States, which has really upset them, and goes to your point about this nervousness. I mean, they already were nervous. And I think the Abraham Accords is a reflection of that nervousness. But the nervousness continues to increase. And I think that is why, for example, in the Security Council, the Emiratis did not support the condemnation of Russia. They finally did in the General Assembly. But remember, the General Assembly has no teeth. The Security Council would have had some teeth, although the Russians would have vetoed it anyway. But it's an indication of this ambivalence, this growing ambivalence toward the United States. They're not going to walk away from us, but they're afraid we're going to walk away from them. So and of course, Yemen, you said Saudi Arabia is the most populous Arab state in the Gulf, but of course, Yemen is the most populous state in that region. And and Yemen has always been the Saudi nightmare, with good reason. If you go back all the way in history, at one point, the Yemenis controlled Mecca. And so, you know, and you know the region. Most people on this Zoom probably know the region. No one forgets anything, no matter how long in the past it was. You know, it's a very interesting culture. It takes you forever to win somebody's trust and 1 second to lose it. But they don't forget anything, for good or bad. I constantly tell my friends in Washington the story, and I'm surprised that they don't know this, because these are people who supposedly know the Middle East. Why did the Saudis host the Kuwaitis when Iraq invaded? They hosted them in Taif. Why were the Saudis the hosts? Could have been others. Kuwaitis were very close to Bahrainis, for example. The reason was, back in the day, literally, when the Turks controlled the whole area, they went after Abdulaziz. And where did he escape to? Kuwait. This was payback. 90 years later or something like that. No one forgets anything. And so you have that as well. And by the way, there was a question about Iran. You got to remember as well that whatever the Iranians do to reach out to the Arabs know that the Iranians look down upon them. That's not anything new. That's just there. And it's been there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so the Iranians resent the Arabs' wealth, and the Arabs resent the Iranians' uppityness, if you will. And so, again, that plays out in Yemen in many respects. The Iranians, the Houthis are a low-cost business for the Iranians. You know, Hezbollah is costly. Houthis are cheap, and they cause so much trouble. And by the way, the Iranians have already succeeded in one respect that you didn't mention, but the Congress of the United States is really opposed to what's been going on in Yemen and to the bombings, particularly the Saudi bombings, and to some extent the Emiratis, but really the Saudi bombings, which is on top of what I said about Khashoggi. So in that sense, the Iranians have helped to alienate the Saudis and the Emiratis from the Congress, or rather the Congress from them. That's a big deal, because that again forces this hedging mentality that you spoke about. Realpolitik, the thing about realpolitik is that the real world forces you to practice realpolitik whether you like it or not. I think Mr. Putin has demonstrated that. To look at the turnaround in Germany. The last thing Germany wanted to do was send arms to Ukraine. The last thing Germany wanted to do was to increase its defense budget. I mean, after all said and done, the United States had been defending Western Europe for decades, and Western Europe didn't spend money on defense like it should have, and it's put its money into the economy. And so I remember in the 80s and 90s, I would visit Western Europe and I would feel that I was coming from a third world country because it was so well developed, so clean, so advanced, and so on. Yet Mr. Putin has driven Germany, a government that includes the Greens, by the way, to announced that it's going to increase its defense budget to a minimum of 2% of GDP.
And extend the life of its nuclear power, which it was going to get rid of.
Absolutely.
And perhaps also eclipse, well, very shortly, if their plans come to fruition, eclipse the UK in terms of spending as part of NATO.
Yes. So as I say, the real world forces people into realpolitik, whether they like it or not. I hope I've responded. As I said, we're in agreement on a lot of these things. So I'm going to look at the chat and see. Okay, here's a question. What are the chances of Israel conducting a preemptive strike on Iran? Well, the Israelis have to think about whether they can really succeed. Their whole game plan was to drag the United States into this because Iran is huge. It's bigger than Texas. And it's got these facilities all over the place. The Israeli Air Force, if it wants to devote the entire Air Force to taking out all the facilities, it still may have trouble. And the reason I say that is because even we, the United States, have a lot of trouble dealing with what's called battle damage assessment. You don't know necessarily that to hit the target you wanted to hit. Look at all the hospitals we hit in Afghanistan. And look at the Russians. I mean, even before the Russians were deliberately destroying everything they possibly could, they were still creating a lot of collateral damage because you go in and you just don't necessarily know that you've hit. Can the Israelis penetrate once, turn around and penetrate again? Very hard to do. They don't have the tankers to do it. So there are too many targets, too few aircraft, too little battle damage assessment, not enough tankers. How do you do it if you're Israel? You get the United States to come in. Do you honestly think the United States is going to come in right now? I mean, if you are, good luck, because I don't think so. Not with this president, not with this administration. And so, as a result, I doubt that the Israelis will. And there's another reason why the Israelis really don't need to. As I said, their biggest problem isn't the nuclear capability that Iran has. They've got 4 levels of defenses. And those of you who are systems analysts or just mathematicians, if you run probabilities, just assume 70% probability that you'll kill an incoming missile. And you've got a lot of levels and a lot of different vehicles for firing missiles. Okay, you're going to have the likelihood that any Iranian missile can get through is going to be less than 1 in 1,000. Run the numbers, you'll see that. What's the likelihood that an Israeli nuclear tip capability, which we all know they have, will get through to Iran? Probably around 100%. If I'm an Iranian general, do I want to take that chance? The problem that Israel faces is not that. The problem is the byproduct of the agreement. And the byproduct of the agreement is no touching on their on their missile capability. So they can put a conventional missile down and fire a lot more of those, obviously. And no limit on how much money we're going to release to these people, which means more money to fund Hezbollah, more money to fund Hamas. That's the biggest problem. It's the byproducts of this deal. It's what we're going to give away and what we're not even going to focus on rather than the actual nuclear. That's my view. And for that reason, I think it's a terrible deal. But whatever your reason, I do believe that A, the administration is determined to have that deal, and B, the Israelis would be really would not be wise to preempt simply because I don't think the United States is going to back them up. All right, let me see what other questions I've got. So someone said that on this question, that depends entirely on the level of threat from Iran that Israel perceives. I believe I dealt with that. You can agree with me or not agree with me, but that's it. I don't see any other chats or questions. If somebody wants to just get rid of their mute and ask me a question, I'll be happy to take one. Barak, is there anything more you want me to talk about?
I think you've covered it. I think you've given a whole macro outlook, a whole macro perspective. So we've been spoiled. How do you ask the question when everything's been already said? So I just find it really interesting that, you know, I remember just sort of like half a year ago or so, before the US withdrew from Afghanistan, you had on Fareed Zakaria, even people like David Petraeus, like really smart people. They were like, enough of the forever wars, and you know, there is just no end in sight here, so there's no winner. And I just get a sense that you need to have somebody establish primacy in the international system, even if that entails a forever war or a few forever wars or foreign engagement. And when you don't have that interventionist approach, then the international system comes apart at the seams. And I think that's one of the reasons why Russia miscalculated, why Putin overreached, because, you know, he got an impression of, hey, look, they scuttled away in a haphazard manner from Afghanistan, empowered the Taliban, didn't really do much on Hong Kong, and in his reading of history, he reached the same conclusion as bin Laden did, that the US is a paper tiger. That was his reading, and he would have got a shock of his life when he miscalculated. But I just find, in order, whether you like it or not, in order to have stability in the international system, you know, the British did it 100 years ago all around the globe. And now it's the US's turn. And I just find it incredible. It's a dangerous world when,
you know, you don't necessarily have to intervene everywhere. I think it's arguable that going into Iraq was a mistake and probably cost us Afghanistan. I was there at the time. I was in the Pentagon, and one of the things that surprised me was when I was asked to be the coordinator for Afghanistan, which should not really have been my job. I had a different job at that point. It became an additional job. But it was a reflection of the fact that our focus had gone to Iraq and we never really finished the job in Afghanistan. But leaving that aside, there were a lot of people who felt that instead of withdrawing entirely, we could have kept a couple of thousand troops there. It would not have driven the Taliban out of the country, but what it would have done, together with aircraft, would have protected the cities where most of the progress on human rights, women's rights, education, and so on was taking place. So that if the Taliban could never really take over the entire country as it did, having 2,500 troops on a permanent basis, well, how many years have we had troops in Germany? How many years have we had troops in South Korea? Nobody talks about that.
Why didn't the US go? Why didn't the US go for that option? Because the way it's presented publicly is all or nothing. Not this.
Well, yes, I mean that was the vehicle for the Biden administration to argue to get out. Obama said the same thing, by the way. He also was an all or nothing guy, and to some extent, so was Trump. But that's not the way it is. I mean, we've got over 20,000 troops in South Korea. We've been in South Korea since 1951. That's more than a half century now. That's more than 60 years now. It's almost 70. It's 70 years, actually. And we've been even longer in Germany. We're in Japan still. We've been in Japan since 1945. So to keep 2,500 troops, by the way, we're still in Syria. To keep 2,500 troops in Afghanistan would not have been that great a burden. Now, the argument is, well, they would have been shot at. Well, if we had the air, we would have really decimated them. It wouldn't have been worth their while. And so I think it was a mistake. I don't think we need, you know, there are those who will intervene at the drop of a hat. I don't think that works. We haven't been very successful with that. One of the reasons is that when you intervene, and Colin Powell said it, if you break it, it's your responsibility. We're terrible at nation building. Our record is we've only rebuilt 4 countries: Japan and Germany, because we flattened them, so, and we controlled them, and South Korea and Taiwan, which took decades of authoritarian rule, and that was it. You can't really point to another one of our interventions. We intervened in Haiti more times than I can shake a stick at. Do you know that the Marines, our U.S. Marines, controlled Haiti for 20 years in the 20s and 30s? Didn't make a difference to Haiti. Somalia hasn't made a difference. The Balkans are still a problem. Iraq we know about. Afghanistan we know about. So where have we been so good at nation building? We're not.
What I'm talking about, what you described beforehand as smart intervention, not just generic intervention.
Exactly
smart
right.
intervention. And you know, we all speak about, you know, sort of the digital age of disinformation, but you know, when you think about it, the way it's been presented to the public, it's just also been a form of disintervention. It's been a disservice, and it's not only had a humanitarian toll, it has a massive strategic cost.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of questions, and I agree. I mean, it's a matter of being much more subtle and cautious about when you intervene, but then when you intervene, you ought to be serious about it. There was a question here whether who would stand with Israel in a scenario like Ukraine, that is to say, if Israel were invaded. First of all, the Israelis have always wanted to stand for themselves. What they've never asked. I mean, the United States does actually have people, military folks in Israel, but very, very small numbers, minuscule numbers. Israel has always felt that it wanted to stand on its own 2 feet. That has a lot to do with Jewish history and its sense of itself. But beyond that, what they do want is the equipment to stand on their own 2 feet. And so, for instance, there's a lot of concern that we still have not released tankers. Now, the reason we don't want to sell them tankers right now is because there's a concern that if we do, that'll disrupt the negotiations for the JCPOA, because the tankers presumably would help the Israelis launch a preemptive attack, although I don't think even that could help them without American direct support. But in any event, the Israelis' plan has always been to stand on their own and get help, military help, the kind of help, by the way, that the Ukrainians are asking for, just lots and lots of equipment. So that would be my answer to that. There was an argument that Biden's been indifferent to human rights in Afghanistan for a long time. I don't think he's been indifferent. I think that his priority was to get out, and it's not a matter of indifference; it's a matter of priorities. Yes, I mean, he's jeopardized the lives, particularly of Afghan women who got an education, and Afghan men who got an education. And I was actually personally involved in, not in a big way, but in a small way, in getting Afghan students out of Afghanistan so they could study at other universities. So it's not indifference, it's priorities. And given the choice, he wanted to get out. Then the question I have here is, why do I think the U.S. left Afghanistan so quickly without planning a streamlined exit, knowing it would leave a vacuum of power in the region? Again, I think partly because of domestic politics. The Americans just wanted out, and particularly the Democratic Party's left wing wanted out. They're anti-anything military anyway. People don't realize how strong that left wing is. I mean, it's beginning to look more and more like the left wing of the Labor Party in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. You've got 100 members, roughly, 100 members of the House of Representatives who belong to what's called the Progressive Caucus. Progressive in America is the Labor left in England, or in Britain, I should say. And those people wanted out. And Biden is very sensitive to that. He has a bare majority in either House of Congress, which means it's very difficult for him to get legislation through. His biggest plan, which he calls Build Back Better, is going nowhere. He literally has no majority in the Senate. The only way a tie is broken, or as you would say, a draw is broken, is with the vote of the vice president. And if a single Democrat opposes anything he's trying to do, that's it. He's lost. And his majority in the House of Representatives, which has 435 members, is 5. So he can't afford to lose people. And if he's got 100 people who want to get out of Afghanistan, he's going to pay attention to that. And I think that, plus the overall indifference on the part of the American public, just pushed him in that direction. Yeah, are there any other questions? That ends the questions. And my hour is almost up. So unless you have any last questions to put to me.
Well, I just want to thank Oliver, and I want to thank you, Dov, for just all your insights, and it's just so enriching. And in the UK, at least, we don't really get that type of strategic insight. You have more politics than policy. So it's something that we very much appreciate.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and happy to do it again sometime.
Thank you, Dov. I'm going to be giving farewell comments at 6 o'clock. So thank you, Dov.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.